Hi there, I'm Mabel Chan, and this is One in a Billion. Do you ever feel an urge to know something about your mother's parents?
What I really wanted to learn was, when I was growing up, why did my mom not talk too much about her parents? You know, I would ask about my grandfather, and she hardly ever mentioned his name.
That's Scott Tong, a Chinese-American reporter for American Public Media's The Marketplace. In 2006, he opened the Marketplace Bureau in Shanghai at a time when China's economy was booming. As China kept rising, the curiosity about his Chinese roots deepened, beginning with his grandfather.
Nobody ever uttered his name. There was no grave, there's no place in the world to remember him. That drove me to pursue this research project of the people who aren't remembered anymore.
In his first book, A Village with My Name, Scott found the place where his grandfather had lived and made some critical choices drastically different from his mother. Why? Here's my conversation in today's episode, This Chinese American Life, Tracing My Roots. So hey Scott, welcome to One in a Billion.
Hi, nice to be with you, Mabel.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? At what point did you decide to become a public radio correspondent for Marketplace?
Well, I grew up in a whole bunch of places, mostly in the eastern United States and in East Asia in Greater China. So my dad worked for IBM, so I was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, in the Hudson River Valley, a couple hours north of New York City. But pretty soon, by the time I was 7 or 8, our lives took us to Greater China. We lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years, back in the States for one, and in middle school and high school, I was in Taiwan. Well, I graduated from Taipei American School, which means I got pretty good exposure to Chinese culture. My Chinese language got pretty good, never good enough for my dad. And then I came back to the States and I went to Georgetown University. And so I spent a fair bit of my adult and working life here, except when, my job moved myself and my family out to China. How did I get into this line of work? The line, as far as my career, is a circuitous route to journalism. I started out working on Capitol Hill for a congressional office, which is for a lot of people, but I decided it wasn't for me after a couple of years. So then I became a print reporter. I wrote for a magazine on healthcare policy, and then I became a television producer for the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. But then I started listening and getting a lot of my news from public radio, and I decided, someday I would like to try to do that. So eventually I started to freelance, and a lot of my stories actually got picked up by the show that I work for now, which is Marketplace, the business show on public radio. And boy, now I'm on year 15 as a correspondent reporter for the show.
This is a very organic path, it seems, for you in terms of becoming a reporter after working in Washington, D.C. and listening to radio and seeing yourself being a part of what you listen to every day, isn't it? There's not a lot of struggle in trying to find who you were and what you were meant to do, unlike a lot of 20-something, even 30-something these days, searching for what they want to be when they grow up.
For sure, there was some searching at the outset. I went to Georgetown University, which turns out a lot of diplomats, which is what I initially wanted to be, so went down that route for a little while. And then, a lot of people who go to a liberal arts school, they end up going to law school, so I thought about that for a few minutes, for a little while, and many of them go on to work in policy here in Washington. So, I tried out a lot of things. By the time I was in my mid-20s or so, I had my first job in the news business, and I decided, boy, this is a pretty good business. It's pretty challenging, but it's something that I really want to do this. I get to ask questions for a living. I get to become a better writer. I get to, tell interesting stories to the world. So pretty soon, pretty quickly, I got hooked.
Let me ask you, at what point did the opportunity to go to China for Marketplace come to you?
That was 2006. So I had been on the staff at Marketplace as a reporter for about 2 years. And then, China was going gangbusters as an economic story. And Marketplace decided that it wanted to open up a bureau back then. I was one of the people who raised my hand. And I was, again, very fortunate that I could get a shot to do this. Now, a year before that, I was part of a reporting team that went to China and did some reporting there, and I found it fascinating. I thought I knew what I was going to expect in China. I speak Mandarin, I lived in Taiwan, I lived in Hong Kong. I know what China is. I did not know what China is.
Tell me about it. I mean, what aspects surprised you during the time you were there for 3.5 years?
Yeah, well, the main thing was the challenge of getting people to do an interview. Chinese nationals know about people who speak to the media and get burned, they get in political trouble. Why would they want to do that? I mean, it's a place where people can be risk averse, and it totally makes sense now to me that in a place that has had a tumultuous political history, in a place where the political winds have blown and people in my own family have found themselves, on the wrong side of history, will be hesitant to say a lot of things in public. If you're in a place where people say certain things in public and then they disappear, they get in trouble, you learn pretty quickly, whether it's your parents or your own generation, to be very careful about who you talk to. And I didn't know that when I first went to China.
Well, let's talk about your book.
Yeah.
A Village with My Name, that's the title. Now, tell us where it is. How long did it take you to find it? And what does it mean to you to have found a village with your name?
As you know, when you're speaking to another ethnic Chinese person, the question, where are you from, tends to come up. I said I knew it was in Jiangsu province, which is the province north of Shanghai, but I didn't know anything more than that. Very often the person asking me the question would well, you should go, right? 你应该去, you should go. It's part of your duty as a Chinese person. I started to internalize this, well, you probably should go. When we were living in China, my wife and I and our 3 young children, my parents came to visit one year, and we decided, let's try to go. Let's try to find this place. So the Tong family village is along what's called the Grand Canal in China. It was a pretty hard place to find. My dad had some distant relatives. They knew an old name of the place before the communists took over. When they took control of China, they changed a lot of place names, like the Tong family village. So once we started driving around and asking, have you heard of this place? Nobody had heard of the place. So then we were stuck. We asked around. My assistant in Shanghai, she did a little bit of internet searching and she helped us. And in the end, we come to this place with, maybe 80, 100 people living in these pretty basic houses in the Chinese countryside. The houses were pretty rudimentary. And at the same time, when you meet people who have the same name as you have, there's something kind of magical to it. Now, my name in Chinese, it means child. If you say child, you say 儿童. It's a very unusual name. So imagine having a very unusual name, and suddenly you come to a place where everybody has the same last name. Something brought us together.
You were able to talk to them in Chinese, right?
Yeah, I mean, my Chinese is, for that kind of thing, it certainly is good enough to ask them about the past, ask them what they do, ask them about the background, and take a lot of notes.
Now, Scott, you talked about challenging family and government orthodoxy in your book. I read your book, and I want you to maybe hone in on the concept of 乱, right? A mess and chaos. You talked about that. Can you elaborate on why was that important for you to confront that? What did you find out?
When you grow up mostly in the U.S., as I have, and you study U.S. political history, you study economic history, very often something comes out of chaos, right? Innovation comes out of chaos theory, trying things, failing before you succeed. That's the American story.
Yes.
So chaos and throwing things around, throwing spaghetti against the wall, that's a good thing. That means you're going outside of the box. In a Chinese political context is a bad word. In China, they've had 150 years of 乱.
Right.
In America, you can have demonstrations. I was born in the late 60s where there were protests all over the place. That's part of the story, right? The protests are what defines America. Well, China has had not protests, but political upheaval, right? Tens of millions of Chinese people have died because of political upheaval. That's what luan means to Chinese people. In the case of my family, in the 1930s, right, the Japanese came to Shanghai and people died, and my grandmother saw that. In the 1940s, the Japanese occupation of a lot of China, people living in cities like Nanjing were slaughtered by the Japanese. My family saw some of that. The Chinese Civil War after World War II ended, were Chinese killing other Chinese people, and my family saw that. And then after the communists came, there were these political witch hunts. Again, Chinese people searching on other Chinese people who had the wrong political stripes. Students would hit teachers. They were tortured teachers. Right, one of my great aunts, because she was on the wrong political side, she was politically stained during what's called the Cultural Revolution. She was forced to stand in the winter under a tree. She had to bow her head down so the icicles couldn't drop into her collar. And she would stand outside for hours. So when I started to learn these stories, many of them connected to my family, I started to realize, there's nothing good in the Chinese imagination to come out of luan. Stability is a lot more important in China, economic stability, political stability, than in the United States. Because the U.S. hasn't gone through what the Chinese have gone through in the last few generations. That's when I started to realize, this is why people are often risk averse. Why did my mom not talk too much about her parents? I would ask about my grandfather, and she hardly ever mentioned his name. Well, it turns out I learned that he was a political prisoner. It was a very shameful chapter in the family history. Nobody ever uttered his name, right? There was no grave, there's no place in the world to remember him. Like, what happened? That's what I wanted to learn. That was what drove me to pursue this research project of the people who aren't remembered anymore. In the case of my family, a lot of Chinese people who are connected to the outside world. A century ago, when China was open to the world, they were opportunists, traders, students, and they got these great opportunities. When the communists came, took over China, the people in my family were the prisoners, and they were the scapegoats. And that includes my grandfather. So I decided, it's my job, I'm a journalist, it's my job to ask this question. What was his story?
What did you come away with?
What I learned about my grandfather was that he had an anti-communist past. And so when the communists took over China, they arrested him, they put him in a famous jail in Shanghai. He didn't come back, so he died there in his 40s. So right now I'm older than my grandfather was when he died. I went to that camp. I found a couple survivors of the camp. And then I learned a very personal story about the power of shame. My grandfather was convicted as a collaborator, so for collaborating with the Japanese occupation. So this is hugely shameful in almost every Chinese context, because collaborating with the Japanese occupiers who did these horrific things in World War II is something that nobody talks about. There were a lot of people who were what you would call collaborators, because the war was a mess back then. Yeah. People were sitting on the fence. They didn't know which side was going to win. They were looking for opportunity to be on the right side of history.
Right.
And if in the end you choose the losing side, then you're a stooge, right? Then you're on the wrong side of history. Many of them, like my grandfather, paid for it with their lives.
What did you find out besides his political position and work?
I learned that my grandfather, like a lot of our Asian grandfathers, was so devoted to his family. So in the middle of the war, when he grew up, his brother died. And so he went back to his own home village to take care of his brother's family, his widow and their children. His father died at an early age too, so he went back to his home village to take care of his mother too, in Hubei province. And I learned he had a really soft spot for his youngest daughter, and that's my mom. One of the few letters we have from him is the letter that he wrote my mom after they left Shanghai to flee for Hong Kong. This is 1950. The communists have taken over all of China, including Shanghai. And the family, my mom's family, decides that they're all going to go to Hong Kong except her father, my grandfather. He's going to stay and run the family business. They have no money, and they have a school, and he's going to try to keep the school running. And so he stays in Shanghai, takes them to the train station, and then he drops them off, and he goes back. And he's so sad, and he writes a couple letters, and one of them he writes a very simple letter to my mom was 6 at the time. He writes, "I hope you can find something to do because when I came home I realized you didn't pack everything. You left your playing cards here. You didn't bring them with you. I hope you can find something to play."
Oh, so tender. Wow, even during such a horrible time that he was dealing with.
Well, yeah, I guess how do you talk to your young child?
Scott, you structure your book in 3 big sections, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you have the great opening, you have the great interruption, and the great resumption. My question for you is, what were you thinking about that structure that would best convey the message of this book? And what is that?
And I wanted to learn about my family and their place in the Chinese historical story. And the historical lesson that I draw is that a lot of what China's doing now is a resumption of an opening to the outside that happened more than a century ago. And as I researched this and read history books and spoke to economic historians, and a lot of them said kind of an undertold part of the Chinese story is of this resumption, is that the Maoist period when Mao and the communists were in control of China in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of the horrific things happened to Chinese people, that was an interruption. The Chinese story, to me, it doesn't begin in, say, 1978. Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping takes over and starts to open China to the outside world. The whole story doesn't start in 1978. The good part of the story starts in 1878. And so my book goes back to then.
One last question about your book. What really matters to you as you look back on your journey back to your home village? Is it about looking back and understanding yourself, your family, giving back to honoring your ancestors?
So yes, and yes. Those things are all important to me. There are a lot of Asian Americans who know a lot about their journey to America, right? How they got here and the sacrifices that earlier generations made coming here. What's also important to me, what happened to those who got left behind?
Yes.
Right, the people who never came. It's not just China. There are so many family histories where the people who got left behind paid a particular price. That's what really compelled me to go to China, to understand what happened to the people who didn't have a chance to come. What were their lives like back then, and what are their lives now?
Thank you, Scott. In our next episode...
Immediately, it was a culture clash. She put egg in his mouth 3 times, and on the 4th time, he had no choice but to swallow. In other words, he spit out 3 times, which was an exercise of will on his part. So I thought, that's force feeding.
That's Lenora Chu talking about her 3-year-old son's experience in a public Chinese school when they were living in Shanghai. She had a hard time adjusting the Chinese style of teaching with force. What would you do if you were her? That's our next episode in 2 weeks. 1 in a Billion is...
Brian Latwinowicz.
Yvette, you. Maggie, she.
And our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy. Let us know if you want to join our team of volunteers, help us plan events, pitch a story. Just go to our website, oneinaBillionVoices.org, and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Support for our podcast comes from our collaboration with the Victor and William Fung Foundation.